Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. I wanted to put together a video discussing the life and career of Val Kilmer, who has unfortunately passed away at the age of 65 just recently. Kilmer has always been an incredible screen presence and someone I grew up with, especially as a kid of the 90s. He was in several high-profile films that were a great part of my childhood, the big one, of course, being Batman Forever. But even as a kid, I was always fascinated by the quality he had on screen of not being an actor you could necessarily pin down. And this, I think, goes into discussing his great strengths of being an actor who was always dedicated to the performance to such an intense degree that each characterization felt unique and also extraordinarily focused and thought out and multifaceted and layered. This may have at times contributed to his reputation in the industry as being difficult, but sometimes I think a lot of that would actually deflect or detract from the incredible levels of the actual performance, which is why I think some of his best roles are ones that are not often as discussed as they should be, chief among them Batman Forever, which suffered from the theatrical cut greatly diminishing layers of that performance due to the removal of major parts of the plot and the Bruce Wayne subplot. But no matter the film or the type of role or the type of story, every time Kilmer is on screen, you get this sense of a character and an actor who's always in the search of the material and really breathing life into a character in such a way that, again, it's a type of person you can't necessarily pin down to any one particular style or feeling or screen persona. And thus, regardless of the actual quality of the final film, Kilmer's performances are ones that stay in your mind. They stay with you. And that's why I think his most iconic roles, the ones that still people talk about and remember him for, they live in the mind's eye because they're a bit different, like the man himself. There's a sense of sometimes an element of danger, but the sense of the unknown, of a sort of spirit that can't quite be tamed or nailed down precisely as one thing or another. And at times, a sense of a mercurial presence, sometimes with a really interesting level of quirky humor that appears from time to time. And all of these, I think, are representative of the man himself in ways. And if you haven't seen the wonderful documentary from a couple years ago, simply entitled Val, you definitely should, because that discusses his various health issues, his throat cancer, and then the loss of his voice, but also how he seems to have at least come to terms with his standing in the industry, his career, where it had gone, his difficult reputation, and where he was in the later stages of his life. It does seem that he had at least achieved some level of inner peace, which was great to see, but that's a really incredible documentary if you haven't seen it, because he also had for a great number of years, basically for his whole career, kept a great series of essentially home video diaries of trying to document his experiences and career and daily life in video form instead of a journal. So there was this incredible wealth of material the public had never seen to pull from and actually give visual documentation of his past and his career. So again, I point anyone interested to look at that documentary if you haven't. But this sort of factor I'm talking about the man himself and all of his great performances having a particular sort of feeling of someone who you couldn't exactly classify as a particular type, or having a personality that was a bit like Quicksilver in a way, a bit elemental in that it seemed to be able to ebb and flow with degrees of nuance and humor that were indefinable. I think that really interestingly fueled a lot of his great performances. And obviously, with his great training coming from the Juilliard School, he was able to just throw himself into all different sorts of genres, even if he was doing so with an intensive actor's mindset of in ways going full method and diving into one's character and living in that character to such a degree that the lines between actor and role basically blurred and became one and the same. There's always a unique quality to a Val Kilmer performance. And again, even in his later career where he was doing a lot more smaller budgeted and independent films, that was still there. So I think all of his films are really fascinating to study the performance and the craft, because it's always there. And I think some of his more fascinating roles are in the lesser or offbeat films, or the films that aren't discussed as much. And again, I don't think he always got the credit he deserved for the level of nuance and characterization that he would bring even to big budget studio films. Of course, there are the notable standout performances first early in his career in films like Real Genius, and then moving on to the incredible whimsy of his performance in Top Secret, which is a very underrated film to this day. And given its spy theme, it's probably my favorite of all the Zuckers Brothers films. But then you move into the basically unstoppable force that is Top Gun, and that is a role. The role of Iceman is something that is on the page. It's something that could be very one note, but like everything else in the film, there's an energy, a spirit, and a style, even with what Kilmer brings to the Iceman role, that makes it memorable and makes it actually work. It makes it play and adds the necessary antagonism for Tom Cruise's Maverick character. So again, like everything surrounding Top Gun, it could have been one note and just sat there without energy, like how everyone felt the original script was when they read it. Kilmer himself didn't want to do it because on the page it didn't really read with any of that. But there's a sort of wonderful standoffish energy and a sort of cockiness that he has there that makes that role stand out in the audience's mind. And I think there's even a degree of that when you look at his performance in Willow, which is a much more classical fantasy adventure type film. But while he has a role that is, again, something that we've seen time and time again, it's a sort of standard role, the standard action hero role, he doesn't play it in that sort of vein the whole time. He takes a different approach. He has the sort of feeling of being a bit of an outsider and allowing his own feelings about the role to sort of dictate his performance. And this is something he always sticks to. So every time he's playing a role, it's not exactly what you would expect. There's that element of danger and risk and deep characterization and deep actor focus on making the character not only unique, but actually making it feel more like a real person. And speaking of real people, we of course have to talk about Oliver Stone's The Doors from 1991, where Val Kilmer just totally invested himself into not only the persona, but the real spirit of Jim Morrison to such a degree that most of the band members felt it was an uncanny sort of resemblance, and even not only mimicking a lot of Jim Morrison's style and his fashion choices and things, but immersing himself into the Doors music so much that he was able to perform the majority of the entire Doors catalog and do so flawlessly. It was as if he was channeling Jim's spirit in a lot of ways, which makes that film so incredible as an experience. As a Doors fan, I have a number of issues with how Oliver Stone portrayed certain events, as do the surviving band members. But it is certainly a film to experience, and Kilmer's performance is just absolutely mesmerizing. It is the soul and lifeblood of that film. It makes all of what Stone is doing in terms of the atmospherics, it makes it take root in something that's physical in terms of his performance, just drawing on all of that. It's a performance that resembles more of a force of nature than just a performance. The next iconic role that he's most remembered for is, of course, in 1993's Tombstone as the legendary Doc Holliday. His is now the Doc Holliday that all other performances are measured against. Again, it's a performance that is so bigger than life and richly textured that it lives in the mind's eye long after you've seen the film. It's endlessly quoted. It's partly why the film is so highly regarded as one of the best Westerns or one of the only Westerns that people in 2025 really know much about. It is the most striking thing about that film and the best thing about that film. It is, in ways, a amalgam of all of the great Doc Holliday performances of the past with all of the legends told about Doc Holliday and what we know about the real life Doc Holliday. It's essentially an amalgam of all of those, just formulated into this incredibly nuanced, just completely realized portrait that feels like a real individual that not only has all kinds of flaws and failings and complexities, but is somebody you also want to know more about. And you actually feel as if you could have a conversation with this character who is a sort of fascinating blending of everything surrounding the Doc Holliday of history and legend and the Doc Holliday of stage and screen. But it's also fascinating to look at it versus the more seemingly historically accurate rendering in the film Wyatt Earp, the performance that Dennis Quaid gives as Doc Holliday, which is definitely much more in line with what we know of the Doc Holliday from history, but still playing in the same realm essentially. And that's a great performance in a very good underrated film. And the films kind of came out back to back and battled each other at the box office due to how the productions were done. But it's fascinating comparing the two different takes of Doc Holliday around the same time in competing productions and seeing how both are excellent performances, but Kilmer's Doc Holliday really is the soul of Tombstone, the movie. And if you remove that, then the film really doesn't have that soul anymore. It is a performance that is so incredibly textured that every single moment that he's on screen, it's as if the film gains that energy and that lifeblood, that indescribable life force that happens only when a movie is working and everything is there to create that spark. I think there's a reason why it has lasted in the way that it has and remains quoted to this very day, even down to being part of internet culture in terms of it being used for memes galore for all the famous quotes. And even there, Kilmer never takes the easy way out. He never chooses the more obvious notes to strike. And so, again, there's this sense of you lose that line between actor and performance, and it starts to feel like a real person, a real character who makes unpredictable choices and reacts as a person would. You couldn't necessarily predict what someone is going to say in each and every moment and predict how they're going to say it. There's such a fully lived in quality in that performance, along with all his other great performances, that makes that stand out and makes that the element that everyone remembers from Tombstone. Everyone who sees that film remembers Kilmer's performance as Doc Holliday. And thus, it's become the Doc Holliday of note that every other Doc Holliday is measured against. And then in the same year, he was able to turn around and in True Romance essentially play the ghostly manifestation of the Christian Slater's character's inner monologue, his guiding figure, who also just happens to be either Elvis or some sort of Elvis impersonator, and giving that sort of task to an actor and then being able to take that and make it into something that actually feels real and that they're able to pull off is a feat in and of itself. Then in 1995, he was, of course, an integral part of the Michael Mann film Heat, and really, I think, is the performance that most underlines the sort of normality of what certain criminals have to try to go through. In terms of his character has the sort of family relationship to worry about, but is also the sort of point man or second in command to De Niro's overbearing presence. And so he's essentially the figure in between the gigantic presences of De Niro and Pacino going head to head throughout the entire film. And that's an incredibly internalized performance in ways. A lot is done without dialogue and without words, with playing in between the moments, which is something he was incredibly gifted at. And again, something that wasn't probably necessarily there on the page. And this plays into what is my favorite performance of his, and the one I think is the most underrated, which is actually Batman Forever. And I think a great deal of that is because his characterization of Bruce Wayne, and thus Batman as well, is incredibly internalized, multifaceted, psychologically driven, psychologically motivated, which he was drawing on elements of the scripts, and famously played scenes and subplots that were not included in the release version of the film, which greatly diminishes the impact of his performance, and I think obscures a lot of the incredibly detailed work he was doing in terms of really getting aspects of the Bruce Wayne character on the screen that we've never seen done in the same way, or frankly, I think he was doing elements that we've never really seen in other Bruce Wayne live action performances. It's, I think, the most psychologically realized and nuanced live action Bruce Wayne performance. But it's just a shame that we've never gotten to see the full scope of it. You get more of that when you dig into the production history of the film, which unfortunately had some butting of heads during the shoot between Kilmer and Joel Schumacher and others. But I think when you dig into what the original version of Batman Forever was, when you look at the comic book adaptation, when you look at the script drafts and you see how that developed, and then you read the novelization and you read about the deleted scenes, and you realize that there was a lot more there that is always suggested by the performance in the theatrical version, and essentially following the trail of breadcrumbs that the theatrical cut indicates. But I always felt I could pick up on some of this stuff when I was a kid, because that's when I started learning about some of this stuff, because I was always so fascinated and enraptured by Kilmer's performance. And again, not necessarily his Batman performance. His Bruce Wayne performance was so textured that I wanted to know more, and that I felt this was a richer vein of characterization, even if I couldn't exactly put my finger on it or put it into words. And as I researched the film more and more growing up and learned more, it started making sense. Some of the choices he was making, what he was pulling from, how that reflected aspects of the character from the comic source. And again, I think it is the most psychologically complex and realized of all of the live action Bruce Wayne and Batman performances, coming from the notion of Bruce Wayne being an incredibly messed up individual with many hangups and mental issues, which is something the film does play around with and get into a little bit with the psychoanalysis. But it's a film that really does need to be essentially put back together, and I think it will allow people to greater realize a lot of what Kilmer was doing with his performance, which is something that I think hasn't necessarily always translated as well as it should have. And I think a lot of that is due to how the final theatrical edit was done, and what was sacrificed was really the entire subplot about Bruce Wayne, which is really the heart of the movie and the meaning of the title. So if I had to say one particular reason why I fight so hard to try to get the original version of Batman Forever at least discussed or recognized, or hopefully one day released in some form, it's primarily to try and convey to people that there was more dramatic meat there originally, and you're not getting the full breadth and scope of what Kilmer's performance was, because significant portions were simply removed from the film. In 1996, he of course was in the infamous Island of Dr. Moreau, which was the film started by Richard Stanley, had a incredibly notorious production, and Stanley was quickly fired, and John Frankenheimer was brought on to essentially try and salvage and finish the film. And between all of the production difficulties, Marlon Brando not being the most cooperative, and then Kilmer himself having caused various issues during the production that only increased his reputation. It was one of those sort of films that seemed to have been cursed from the start, but you see it, and again, Kilmer's performance is such that it's obviously not the lead role, but it's a role that is infused with a character actor's level of intensity. As always, you can never take your eyes off of whatever character he's playing, even if he's not really even doing anything. So I think that film's kind of cursed from the beginning, and I don't think that H.G. Wells' classic story has ever really truly been done justice fully in the way that Wells wrote it. That's one of those stories that I think still could have a definitive adaptation, but it's also a very difficult book to adapt in terms of adapting to a film. But in the same year, he made The Ghost in the Darkness, which also had a troubled production that went through a significant story change when the Michael Douglas character was very much expanded and the whole tone of the story changed. But again, Kilmer's performance is fascinating because he's playing a very straight-laced character this time, and for most of the opening half of the film, it's a very taut narrative about his character being introduced into this very barren environment and having to fight off vicious lion attacks. It starts out as a pure historical suspense thriller in a way. And while I still think it's an enjoyable film with an absolutely brilliant 5.1 sound mix for the era, I mean, it's got absolutely brilliant sound design. It's a film that I really admire certain aspects of, and I really like the lead performances, but you can definitely tell there's essentially almost a point at which halfway through where the whole movie sort of changes. It's kind of interesting in a way that he was in two films back to back that didn't exactly set the box office on fire and had troubled productions. But again, in each of them, he's playing a completely different type of character who is fascinating in and of themselves, even if they're not necessarily the most vocal character. Then we come to what is my other favorite performance of his ever since I was a kid, and that's the 1997 version of The Saint, which was essentially designed around him as a sort of star vehicle, and of course being a new sort of origin take on Leslie Charteris's iconic Simon Templar character, just updated and modernized for the 90s. While most Saint fans and purists have definite objections with what the film does in terms of how it messes around with the Saint character, and I can completely understand why they feel that way, and I agree in some aspects, it's really not exactly the same as the Charteris original. It's essentially a new 1990s revisionist take on the character. But I do think it carries over a lot of the general ideas and concepts. You have obviously the man who can assume any sort of disguise and is a sort of modern day knight going around the world, righting wrongs in his own particular way with his own particular code and code of ethics, and essentially leaving a sort of trail of his goodwill at times, his daring do at others, his desire for self-improvement in terms of wealth and others. It's actually, I think, a quite unique take on the Charteris original. It's, I think, playing up to all of Kilmer's strengths and what he liked to do in performance. And, of course, gives him the ability to play all the other different characters that the Simon Templar of the film disguises himself as. He not only will assume a disguise and pretend to be someone else, he will enmesh himself into that. And essentially, it's a performance within a performance. It's one of those great times where you see an actor essentially having a performance in a performance, sometimes inside of another performance, when you see the awareness of the actual character playing another role, whether in full makeup or not. So the Simon Templar of the 1997 film, also greatly fueled, I think, by Philip Noyce's excellent direction, is a fascinating enigma in and of himself. He is a chameleon, and it's almost as if this version of Simon Templar was tailor-made for Val Kilmer's style of performance and what he liked to do, and that does seem to be the case, as it was a star vehicle for him. It did do well at the box office, but sadly, we never got a sequel, and I think there would have been some really interesting material to develop there, because I do think that Kilmer's performance in this particular version of Simon Templar, even though it's really doing its own thing in a lot of areas, the way it plays around with being set in the late 90s and also having one of the great compilation soundtracks of any film in terms of its usage of electronic music. It's a really fascinating atmosphere to sort of dive into. I think it achieves what a number of late 90s techno and Euro thrillers were trying to do, but with a big budget film. And I just think it would have been interesting to see where that went. It's also another film that had significant changes made before the final release. The entire final act was hastily altered, and so we've never actually gotten the original version with a bigger action climax and a dark ending, which really makes more sense for this being an origin film for the Saint character. I would hope that someday that also is able to be put back together and released. You can read some description about the original final act and ending online. There's some clips that have surfaced from low quality versions, and I think the novelization also, like Batman Forever, does give you a picture of what the original film was like. So that's another film that I've always hoped would be properly presented one day with the original version intact. After this, he would star in the animated Prince of Egypt, and then a variety of roles as his career sort of definitely transitioned over into another sort of status where his sort of reputation had essentially kind of caught up with him, and you could see the number of high profile roles would start to diminish greatly, and then he would start doing more and more independent films and lower budgeted films with basically more and more extended gaps in between. And he basically would acknowledge this later in life and in the documentary, that he started having to essentially deal with how he had been in his career, and that his career had changed. And in a way, it played into also, I think, how he kind of would describe himself sometimes as being more of a character actor with leading man looks, and that he sort of straddled that fence and never really felt comfortable as a lead actor, which does make sense in a way. I do think he always had a character actor's mentality of being extraordinarily focused on the craft and his own character and individual performance. I think you see that in every film. So in some ways, I think this sort of career shift allowed him to experiment more and take on more roles that could get even darker or go different places, whether it would be in the underrated Wonderland or Spartan for David Mamet. And then you get to one of, I think, his great performances in a film that I've loved ever since I first saw it, which is 2005's Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, where he once again gets to flex his comedy chops and is absolutely hysterical alongside Robert Downey Jr. And part of what made that film a bit on the edge and so feel so special is that it had two actors who were once industry A-listers who had, through the events of their lives, sort of lost that status and were no longer seen at that level. And it was a smaller, more independent film. And it was Shane Black getting to do essentially a lot of the things he always wanted to do, but was never allowed to by the major studios because they were making this smaller independent film. So it had a wild flavor. It drew heavily on classic hard-boiled crime literature, and I adore that film. I still hate the fact that we never got a sequel. Yes, there was eventually Shane Black making The Nice Guys, which is basically a sort of spiritual successor, and I enjoy that film, but it's just not the same. It doesn't have that same undeniable spark to it, and there's such a joy of performance that Kilmer has in the film. It's like you get to see him cut loose in a way and just enjoy the craft and enjoy the moment. And that's something that makes that film all the more special to me. And also, if you've never listened to the commentary track, it's basically Val Kilmer and Robert Downey Jr. just taking the piss out of each other the whole time. And it's in some ways, it's as enjoyable as the movie itself. It's one of those few commentaries where you just enjoy them making fun of each other. After this, Kilmer did a variety of other films. Again, a lot of independent films. He even started doing some occasional TV spots again. And he was able to do his sort of passion project, which was his one-man show of playing the legendary Mark Twain. It was called Citizen Twain, and I really wish I'd been able to see that because it was him essentially doing intricate performance of the legendary Mark Twain, and then sort of blurring the lines between, again, actor and role and performance by, over the course of the performance, starting to remove the layers of makeup. So by the end, it was merely the actor there. And again, in a sort of way, trying to blur and almost obliterate the lines between what is actor, what is performance, what is character, and sort of enmeshing them all into a sort of natural state of flux where they're all really the same thing. Eventually, his throat cancer diagnosis and then other health issues really just put a stop to his career, and then sadly he did lose his voice and have to rely on electronically generated voices, and then really touchingly made his last appearance in Top Gun Maverick in the best scene of that film, where it's just a one-on-one two-hander scene between Val Kilmer and Tom Cruise. It's always hard to see or think of anyone going through that particular health issue and how it just completely upends someone's life. So again, I do highly recommend the documentary Val, which does go into that and is rather intimate in how it's done. I mean, it doesn't really pull any punches, which makes that documentary extraordinarily rewarding. So I'm just really glad he was able to do that documentary and then make that final appearance in Top Gun Maverick to at least have a nice sort of end note for his career, even though it wasn't obviously intended as that. But in any case, I just wanted to put something together for one of my favorite actors of the sort of generation I grew up in. Somebody I've loved since I was a kid, somebody I've always found fascinating, and especially because they were really an original. They were an original spirit. They had a particular unique style, and this always manifested in performances that were themselves unique and live on in the mind's eye afterwards. You don't even have to rewatch the film to suddenly think of a particular moment, a gesture, a line reading, something he would do. They are characters that live in the mind, almost like the ghostly character that lives in Christian Slater's head in True Romance. It's a similar sort of idea in a way, and they're performances that stick with you, I think, because they're not really characters you can essentially pigeonhole as one thing or another. There's always a texture, a degree of nuance, a feeling that there's additional layers there that you have to peel back. And that's why I think his performances of characters who were extraordinarily complex in their psychological makeup are so fascinating. That's why I feel his Bruce Wayne is the most fascinating of all the live-action Batman performances. That's why I have always been obsessed with the style and the particular sort of disaffected outsider chameleon of the version of Simon Templar found in the 1997 film. There's such incredible richness in all of his performances that it's, I think, a really fascinating body of work to look into, even if some of the other films maybe aren't up to that same level of quality. The performance is always fascinating, and also it was fun to see when he could dip more into the comedic vein, even in things like MacGruber, and sort of poke fun at himself in a way. So it's, I think, a fascinating body of work to look at that sort of runs the gamut of going into different genres and different styles and different tones. And even though his career never really achieved the heights that I wish it had, there is something to be said about his continuing on and still trying to find something to invest himself in each performance, something to essentially draw the actor's attention and desire to keep going. So I just wanted to put something together because I was just reacting like everyone else to the sad news of his passing this past week. And so, especially as someone who grew up on his most famous films and someone who's been a Batman Forever obsessive since the age of 5, and somebody who's been obsessed with trying to get the original version of Batman Forever released, I definitely felt the need to say something. So I hope this has been at least somewhat interesting, fun, or informative to hear me reflect on some of my favorite Val Kilmer performances in films, and some of what I've always loved and admired about his craft and his technique, and his own unique, impossible to pin down screen persona. So I strongly encourage everyone to either revisit or look at some of the films I've mentioned, but also to dig further into Kilmer's filmography. I know I certainly am, and I'm going to try to see some of his films and performances that I haven't before, because, again, there's always something unique and interesting with whatever he's doing on screen. Even in films that are a bit more off the beaten track, or films that aren't discussed very much, even a rather interesting, underrated film like Thunderheart has a central, fascinating Val Kilmer performance. So there are great riches to be found in his filmography, and I encourage everyone to look at his body of work as a means of reflection, as we do when artists pass on. So in any case, I do hope this has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do look into his incredible filmography and reflect on the work of one of the most unique actors of his generation. And so I'd like to say, as always, thank you ever so much for watching.